Welcome to Collected Talks of David Solomon, podcasts on Jewish history, the Bible, Jewish mysticism, philosophy, and thought. Find out more about David's upcoming classes, publications, and other recorded lectures by visiting davidsolomon.online. And now, here's the lecture.
Here is the final episode of this four-part series on great battles in Jewish history. As with previous episodes, maps have been provided on the episode webpage for podcast listeners who do not have the benefit of seeing David's whiteboard diagrams from the live talk. This will be the final episode for 2020, as the production team will be taking a break for the Australian summer holidays. The podcast will return in February 2021. In the meantime, we encourage you to go back to listen to earlier episodes that you may not yet have heard. If you are enjoying the podcast and would like to see it continue, please consider becoming a sponsor on Patreon or to make a one-off donation. It would be great in 2021 to be able to cover the costs of hosting and producing these episodes. We wish you all safe and well over the next few weeks, and may 2021 usher in easier times.
It's nice to see everyone back, nice to see everyone here. Let's remind ourselves that this is battles in Jewish history, and the first battle I looked at, well, the first week we looked at battles of the Tanakh. I looked specifically at three battles. Yep, you would remember that. I looked at the Battle of Tavor, and the Battle of Moreh, and the Battle of Gilboa. And what did all those three have in common? They all happened in the one place, that Jezreel Valley. Yep. And, as you rightly pointed out, terrain, it was a good way of us understanding that terrain is vital, and the topography and the terrain and the layout of the land of Israel is vital for us to understand Jewish history generally, but certainly Jewish military history. In the second week, I looked at four battles, which was the Battle of Ma'ale Levona, the Battle of Bet Horon, the first Battle of Bet Horon that we call it, the Battle of Emmaus, and the Battle of Bet Sur. What did all those four have in common? They were all fought by the Maccabees in their early battles. These are the four battles that led up to the Hanukkah story. The Maccabees fought many more battles after that, but it was those four battles. Once again, we looked very, very carefully at topography and the geography of the land of Israel, because the Maccabees developed that idea that you could use the topography as a weapon to basically a higher degree than we've just about ever seen. In the third week, we looked at the siege of Yodfat, and the siege of Gamla, and the siege of Yerushalayim. What did those three have in common? Well, yep, we lost them all is one thing they have in common. And they're against the Romans. They're all really part of the one campaign that the Romans took in between 68 and 73 to conquer Judea and completely eradicate its previous political structures and move it as part of a province of the Roman Empire. This week, and I ended off last week when we talked about sieges, I said that's a segue into the 20th century, because I mentioned the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is kind of, there was a Jewish army that fought with the Persians against the Byzantines in the early 7th century. Some of you might have heard me talk about that in other contexts, Nehemiah ben Chushiel and so on. But apart from those kind of very, very isolated incidents, the real inspiration for Jews to begin fighting again in the 20th century, although they had already formed some military structures in Palestine, there was a big spark in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and it happened as a result what was effectively for several days in a hopeless situation, but it was more or less a siege, and that's why I segued from the siege of Gamla and the siege of Yerushalayim and Yodfat to the siege of the Warsaw Ghetto. But now what that means is we find ourselves in the 20th century, and as I've alluded to for these last few weeks, I'm going to spend this talk talking about the 20th century. And as you know, I don't know if you heard about it, but we had a few battles, military battles fought by the Jewish people in the 20th century. Beyond the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, we're now, of course, talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict and our attempts to establish our own Jewish homeland in Palestine, which became Israel, and it's the land of Israel. It's always been the land of Israel. And that wasn't an easy thing to do. And it's been an ongoing military as well as political struggle. But of course, we're then faced with a vast array of options of what I can cover in a talk like this evening. I can't do it all. And I'm also talking to an audience that in many ways, in fact, when I look at this audience, we can say, and there's not a lot of bar mitzvah bochers happening here, and so most of us would kind of live through a lot of those periods and would remember some of those conflicts very vividly, even if we weren't there ourselves. And maybe some of us were there ourselves that are in this room tonight during some of those conflicts. Some of you would be thinking, oh, I reckon I can guess what he's going to talk about tonight. And I know that Tony's sitting there whirring with the minds. And I know, Tony's sitting there and he's going to go, like, you know, all the other hardcorers, he's going to go, come on, give us the Iratika in 67, that's what we want to get. How was that taken, brick by brick and everything? I'm not doing that. I thought about doing that. In fact, that was the first one on my list because it's so exciting, such an amazing battle. But I'm not going to do, and here we go, brace yourself, I'm going to do two battles tonight, and they're not in 1967. The reason I'm not going to do 67 tonight is because, yes, 67 is amazing, but it's triumphalist and it's fantastic and rah, 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 we go, but it's not actually that interesting from a military point of view. There are one or two aspects that are very, very interesting for other kind of military thoughts that we might have, but it's difficult to go into in depth, and also it was fought on so many fronts and so quickly that it's difficult to cover. So I'm going to do two battles tonight, and then I was going to give equal weight to these battles, and then I thought, no, I won't. I will actually spend most of the time on one of them, on the second one, and on the first one, which really would require its own separate talk, I'm just going to cover in 10-15 minutes, because I think it's so important that I want us to have an awareness of that battle, and also because some of the people that fought in the first battle I'm going to talk about are going to pop up again in the second. And we haven't had a lot of that. Or with the Maccabees we had it, but not a lot. So let's first of all remind ourselves of the land of Israel. All right. So the first battle I want to talk about, and I'm choosing it because it's also interesting for us, having done this series of talks, that the geography of this is going to be a little bit familiar because it happens in pretty much exactly the same place as a previous battle we looked at. Let's put in the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, all right? And that would mean that we can put Yerushalayim here, yeah? As we have done on many occasions, and we've got this is going to be the Hare Yehudah, the hills of Judah. There's going to be Samaria. Here, of course, Jezreel Valley. This is where our battles have taken place in various phases. And this area here, as we've discussed many, many times, is called what? The Shfela. And we've looked at the valley passes through the Shfela. And of course, the one that everybody keeps coming back to, historically, is that largest of the valleys that go through the Shfela, if you were coming from the coast to Jerusalem, which is, of course, which valley? Ayalon. The Ayalon. And the Ayalon is where, even today, the main road goes when you go from Tel Aviv or the airport, you go to Jerusalem, and the Ayalon is going to come, the Ayalon Valley cuts directly through here, and, of course, takes you up onto the ridge passes or the ridge roads that lead to Jerusalem, either by the north or whatever. So the Shfela is a very, very important part of the topography of the land of Israel. And it's the main connector. So right throughout history, doesn't matter whether you're the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Seleucids, whoever you are, you're sending an army, or even the Egyptians, you're sending an army to conquer this area. you're going to come up more than likely through that, because that's the most efficient and quickest and easiest way of getting in. It's the widest valley. You can put an army through there. As we have looked at in previous battles, that wasn't always the case, because it wasn't always easy, and generals got nervous when they were marching armies through there if they were fighting a very mobile guerrilla force, as we were able to form at various stages throughout history. Now, in the 20th century, don't know if you heard about it, but there was a British mandate over Palestine. Yep. Oh, and of course, just before I go into that, what is the major thing that we always learn about the Ayalon when it meets the Shfela, which are these low foothills that sit before the higher hills of the Judean mountainside? What are you going to encounter as the coastal plain enters that valley between those foothills? What are you going to encounter? Well, what would, if you were the occupying entity here, and not the invading one, but you're the occupying one, what are you going to put at that pass? Fortifications. The whole existence behind the various cities, towns, and fortifications in the land of Israel are all about the topography of where major movements would be made. And so we saw in biblical times, basically Shlomo HaMelech onwards established Gezer, which was on the Ayalon Pass. In later antiquity, that's Roman times and so on, it was Emmaus. And Emmaus is mentioned not only in relation to the Maccabees, but also in the New Testament as well. Emmaus is a known place. Yes, did you say something? So Latrun is Emmaus. Yes, effectively. I mean, Emmaus is a ruin, but Latrun is a fort. So the first battle I want to look at, and we're already 1:45, and I only can't spend more than 10 minutes on this, but I want to show it to you, is, of course, the famous issues surrounding the Battle of Latrun, which happened in 1948. In fact, to call it the Battle of Latrun is kind of a misnomer. It really should be called the Battles for Latrun. And I'll explain what that is and explain why, but effectively what happened is this. The mandate was due to end in the middle of May in 1948. The partition plan had been passed at the UN during the previous year, and the Brits had said, we'll hold the mandate, we'll abide by what the UN tells us, we'll leave, and Birkat al-Amak after that, right? We know we've got Arabs here, we've got Jews, and they'll have to sort it out, but we're tired, we want to go home. All right? On the eve of that departure of the British, by the way, just before I launch into Latrun, just to give myself an idea, who would be able to put up their hand and say they'd claim a 5 on this topic, at least? Good. Oh, good. Very good. Very good. Very good. And higher? Okay. So if I'm talking about this, I've read a fair amount of this over the times, but I'm going to give a 10-minute summary. If I say anything that you think is not right, because it's a very, very, very complex period, the 1948 period. People, when we learn it at school or when we learn it at Zionist youth camps, we think, yeah, War of Independence, we won it, move on. But just about, exactly, every single thing that happens in 1948 doesn't just have significance for itself, it becomes like a kind of a founding myth of the state of Israel itself. These names like, Ariel and Latrun and, Gush Etzion and all these kind of things, they become like legends, especially for the military. But Latrun is a fort that the British built. It was actually in the location of what had previously been a Crusader castle. We haven't even talked about the Crusaders when they occupied the land of Israel, because not many of them were Jewish. So I didn't include it. And for much of the Crusader kingdom, Jews weren't even allowed anywhere near it. When the Crusaders occupied the land of Israel, they occupied this entire area, they also built a famous Crusader castle there, right there at Emmaus, or what subsequently became Latrun. And you can see it from the highway as you enter. It's that kind of low foothill on the right as you would enter the Ayalon Valley. Next time you look for it, and there are signs going, if you come, it's like Latrun. Now, when the Brits came on that site, they built one of their big British forts. Well built, concrete, serious fort. And they occupied it, because that is a key point, that you would occupy it if you had a mandate over a country that was ripping itself apart. All good? Baruch Hashem. Just making sure the mic's on, because I can feel a good talk coming on. The Crusader Castle location was where the Brits built this fort, and they called it, which is actually a contraction of the original French medieval name, and they called it Latrun. It became known as Latrun. The Brits said, we're leaving on May 15th. Fine. And on May 14th, as the Brits are zipping up their suitcases, Ben Gurion gets up and declares a state. All right? And says, not only are we creating a Jewish state, you can be damn sure we're going to defend it. We don't want to have to defend it. We want it to be respected, but that's what's going to happen. Now, on the eve of all this happening, the Palmach was sent to occupy Latrun. And when they got to Latrun, the Brits had vacated. There was no actual fighting happening around Latrun, because it wasn't exactly on a border per se, but they occupied Latrun. But shortly after, they left. They left because they were ordered to fight in hotter conflict areas on borders. I mean, you can't have a whole battalion of the Palmach sitting around doing nothing, just watching a road, if you've got intense fighting in other areas for your survival. So the Palmach was sent, I think, mostly down to Egypt or wherever it was they were sent, where we had 7 invading armies, which meant that Latrun was actually sitting kind of empty at the very, very beginning of the declaration of the state. And it didn't take long, no more than a couple of days, before the Jordanians, the Arab legions, and if you recall, when I say you recall, I'm not meaning to say that you don't recall, but if you would remember from what you've studied that the Jordanians, of all the Arab armies, the Jordanians were the best fighters and they were the best trained soldiers and they had the best equipment. Why? Because the British had trained them to be an army. So the legions came down and they occupied Latrun. So the real point of the story is the fact that this soon became an untenable situation, primarily because in occupying Latrun, once the War of Independence starts and once it proceeds, what can they do from Latrun? They simply block the road from Latrun, and anyone trying to drive from here to go up to Jerusalem gets geschmacked with artillery, thank you very much. Not just to mention machine gun rifle, grenades, whatever it is they're going to throw. You've got an entire Arab battalion occupying Latrun, hundreds of soldiers, whose sole directive is to control this area and not let anyone through from the west to Jerusalem. Now, as you know, the War of Independence went through various stages. There was intense fighting, then there was a ceasefire, then there was more intense fighting. But the new Israeli leadership, both political and military, saw that if they did not fix that situation and take Latrun, then West Jerusalem was going to be cut off. It was going to be sieged, it was going to cut off, it was going to run out of supplies, we were going to lose the whole of Jerusalem. Things in Jerusalem started to get a bit hairy and affairy as well. Food supplies were running short, water was running short. But even outside the considerations of the whole population of West Jerusalem, which by this time was considerable, we could not afford to lose that corridor in any sense.
How far is Latrun from Jerusalem?
25 miles, maybe 35 k's. As Ben Gurion said, there can be Jerusalem without Israel, but there can't be an Israel without Jerusalem. His words. This is what he said to his company. We have to take Latrun. So the first attempt to take Latrun was an operation known as Operation Bin Nun, which subsequently became known as Bin Nun Aleph.
It was a disaster.
A complete disaster. Okay. You're absolutely right. And I'm covering this very quickly. So I can already tell, because you know that I'm going to apologise to you in advance of how quickly I need to cover this. The first attempt was a disaster. One of the reasons it was a disaster is because they conscripted into this attacking force a couple of hundred guys who had literally just got off the boat from the Holocaust. Can you imagine coming out of the camps, being in an internment camp, having all of that thing, finally getting on a boat to Palestine, and it's basically as soon as you arrive, they put a rifle in your hand, they say, now you've got to go and fight for our new homeland. A lot of them died. Imagine finding yourself under fire after that experience. That was one disaster, but there were many, many other disasters. Bin Nun Allah failed. One of the most famous people that was wounded at Bin Nun, at the first operation Bin Nun was? Oh, well done. Oh, she's good. You get in trouble, but you're good.
Weren't the Jordanians sitting in trenches, dugout trenches?
Yeah, they were defending Latrun, but they were in the fort. I mean, it's a massive concrete fort. You can, once again, when I give this series again, I'm going to use some audio visuals, but, it's a huge concrete fort. So, she said Ariel Sharon.
Oh, right.
Sorry, I thought you'd heard it. Ariel Sharon was wounded, shot in the guts in that first, I don't know if he had as much guts then as later on to absorb that, but he was seriously wounded in that first attempt. So they tried it again in an operation called Bin Nun Bet. And that too failed. Once again, a disaster, operational failures. The Harel brigades were supposed to come in the Paba. Everybody got confused when you were nighttime, and the Jordanians just picked people off until they had to say, this now has to retreat. That's two operations fail. Then they tried this massive operation, which was actually part of an operation called Operation Yoram, in which they thought they would take a whole lot of area of the West Bank, including Latrun, but had a specific focus against Latrun, and that too failed due to operational failures. It's almost like God said, you're not yet going to take the West Bank. I have another plan for the West Bank. It doesn't matter what these forces, which were successful everywhere, in many, many other places, miraculously in the War of Independence, couldn't take Latrun. They had 5 different attempts, 5 different operations to take Latrun, and they couldn't. But while all these operations were failing, the people in Jerusalem were beginning to run out of everything. As I said, including water. We're talking children missing meals. We're talking an entire population Jewish population of well over 100,000 who were under serious threat. And it was unconscionable to the new state that they were not going to save this. And yet the Jordanians held. So first of all, the first thing was that they had to sort out that situation. But they could not take Latrun, and they could not get through this corridor. And of course, not to mention the fact that the whole of the rest of the access to this area, Judea and Samaria, was controlled by the Jordanians. This was not an area, by the way, controlled by the Jordanians. This was Jordan, as far as the king of Jordan was concerned, and the Arab legions. And also this part was never part of the original mandate. But they had to take Latrun, but they couldn't. So what did they do? And it's amazing that what the Israelis did in the War of Independence is something that no other invading army had ever done, never thought to do. And remember I said last week, engineers win wars? They built a new road behind Latrun, about 2 kilometers to the south here, over the next ridge, so that the Jordanians, who may have suspected something was going on, because if dozens and dozens of bulldozers and trucks and things are suddenly arriving, but they couldn't sight it with their artillery. So they couldn't directly attack it. And it took them only a matter of weeks to build an entire road called famously the Burma Road, based on that road that was built by the British in Burma in the World War II, and it circumvented the whole of the Latrun and then joined up with the Israeli-controlled part of the corridor into West Jerusalem. Not only did they, and you can still go and see the Burma Road today, and you can see it. It is phenomenal. And it was the main road into Jerusalem for Israelis for about 6 months, at least until in 1949, there was an armistice or a truce signed that was able to protect the Israeli access to the corridor. Even then, it wasn't always that safe. And Israel had to take alternate roads in those days. I don't know if anyone remembers ever going I don't remember this, but nor was I really around, but going from Tel Aviv or the airport to Jerusalem prior to 67. Would you remember such an experience? Yeah, and it was not the same roads you had to take today, because the Jordanians, on a good day may not shoot at you, but on a bad day, if they were feeling a little bit itchy, they might. But the Burma Road was the main road for the next, quite a number of months. They were able to, sorry?
And the parallel railway actually went over the Jordanian border for a little bit.
It did. Well, not to mention Mount Scopus and all that kind of thing, but yeah. But not only that, but what else did they build? They didn't just build a road, which eventually within a few weeks was able to deliver like 100 tons of material to Jerusalem every day with trucks coming up. And they built it in silence and in secret. It was amazing. They also built a pipeline, which became known as the Silwan pipeline, which fed water into Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was running out of water. You turn on the tap, nothing would come on. And within a few days, they were able to build this pipeline. And it was one of the most amazing, miraculous stories of the War of Independence. So I wanted to talk a bit about Latrun, because it became so foundational, because we all drive past it when we go to Israel, and because you can see it fits right into some of the geographical things that we've been talking about. Yep. So Latrun is an important topic, and I wanted to cover it. I also wanted to, just want to see if there's, oh yes. Yeah. There is one interesting aspect about Latrun that would be remiss if I did not mention, and not just about Latrun, but about, which I regard as a battle, but the way it was solved with the Burma Road. Who built the Burma Road, Yossi? Yeah, you will when I tell you. Who oversaw the building of the Burma Road? Marcus. Mickey David Marcus, who was a retired American officer who came to fight with the IDF and who Ben-Gurion called our first real general, and was killed shortly after this and the completion of the Burma Road by Israeli soldiers, because he didn't know the password coming back to camp one night, and they shot him. I have to point out, there's an ugly and there's a good, and there's or a not so good. There is some revision on that. There was some revision on that. It's not such a simple story. There's conspiracy theories around it. So these legendary names become part of the fabric of the newly created Tzahal, Tzva Haganah Yisrael, the new IDF, and it has these incredible mythical heroes and stories, and Latrun is right up there. Now, but that's not the battle I'm going to really concentrate on tonight. They kept Latrun. Sorry, they kept Latrun. They stayed in. We never ever got Latrun. So all of this for the next 20 years was Jordanian. In 67, that's when we just did this. That's what we did in 67. Then obviously we took Latrun.
How did they get there? How did they do it? How did they overcome that to take Latrun?
Oh, by 67, it's a completely different picture. I mean, by 67... I mean, the Arab legionnaires were probably sitting there with the same equipment they had in 48. And that's not necessarily an exaggeration either. But what happens to Latrun, in summary, is that it gets taken in 67, because in 67 we exploded over everything. Everything that had been difficult in 48 was peanuts to us in 67. I don't think you realise, well, you do realise because you lived through it, many of us. I was extremely young, but I'm sure some of you would remember it. I mean, and even the Arabs said the hand of Allah is with the Jews. We're talking 67 was an absolute knockout. So how exactly we took Latrun is interesting, and I'm sure some soldiers and maybe even a couple of tanks were involved in that particular situation, but it wasn't the same world as 48. All right? So can we move on from... Huh?
Not the same army.
Exactly.
Not the same community.
Although in some ways the same period. Can we move on from Latrun? Because I need to talk, but I just wanted to talk about Latrun because I wanted to highlight how foundational that is. All right? Everybody happy with me so far? Yeah. We good? Now, having said that, it really, really, really was a crushing victory in 67. But it left a map that was unconscionable to the Arab world. It was a humiliating defeat. But it was really only the opening chapter on the unfolding of has happened since. I want to look now for the next while, and some of you are going to clench your sphincter when I say this, because it's not an easy one to look at, but I've wanted for quite a while to talk about this, because I think this battle has just about everything in it that is of interest to those studying, the way that battles change or affect or affected by history. And I'm going to look at the Yom Kippur War, but I'm not obviously going to look at the whole Yom Kippur War because we would need an entire series to do that effectively. I'm only going to look at one part of it, and I'm going to look at the battle for the Sinai in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Yep, I know that many of you are going to have an even greater familiarity with that. I know that some of you are going to know many of the things I'm going to talk about, and it doesn't hurt us to do revision, and I welcome corrections, as you can see. But I want to talk about this because I've got to tell you, I've been reading a lot about this over the years. It's a very hard thing to summarize. I find it fascinating. I found it fascinating when it happened, and I was just a young boy, but I have found it fascinating since. But it was only this morning that I found a quotation in a book called The Making of Israel's Army by Yigal Allon, one of the great founding military fathers of the State of Israel, a man who this and that. And he's writing this book. He writes this book called The Making of Israel Army, which is a whole series of essays about the IDF, about Israel, about his military thinking, about what the military thinking of the upper echelons of the Israeli army has been since the founding of the state. Essays on how to command men and all the rest of it, right? And he has a chapter here, and oh, by the way, this book was sitting in my parents' library when I was growing up, and I can remember seeing it, but it never looked that interesting to me for a while, because I just thought I must have picked it up when I was young, and I thought, some Israeli general talking about... I was too young to appreciate it, so I hadn't read it. And then, but for some reason this morning, I thought, what can I look at to pick up that could tell me something interesting? And I picked up this book, because I really, really, really wanted to find this quote. It is a phenomenal quote. Okay, I'm going to come back and I'm going to find, because I thought, oh yes, no, here it is. Now this is where I wanted to start, because I'm going to come back to this, because this is really, if you know what I'm about to talk about, this is amazing. So he's writing this in 1969, yeah? So put yourself in 1969, and we are still in that wave of triumphalism. We have the old city of Yerushalayim, Har HaBayit Biyadenu, we have the West Bank, we have the Sinai, we have the Golan. We have things we have a state the size we never dreamed of. Let's just enjoy it for a while. And this is in a book called The Making of Israel's Army, an essay called Since June 1967. And Yigal Allon writes, I have always believed in the saying of the ancient philosopher of war, Sun Tzu. Now, Sun Tzu, as you know, one of the great military philosophers, and in fact there was a couple of times that I was tempted to mention Sun Tzu in earlier talks in this series, especially in relation to the first talk. I wanted to bring in a bit of Sun Tzu and a bit of Clausewitz and a few other military thinkers, but he quotes this. He goes, I've always believed in the saying of Sun Tzu, and here's the quote he brings. The theory of war teaches us not to rely on the possibility that the enemy will not come, but on preparedness to meet him. not to rely on the prospect that he will not attack, but on the fact that we have made our position invincible. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Yom Kippur War will know how incredibly ironic that is. First of all, we have to background this for a few minutes, and then I'm going to cut to the chase, because I can see people already getting, you good? I don't need to explain to this audience when I look around, and I mean that respectfully, but I don't need to tell you what the Cold War was. We all most of us, lived through big chunks of it. And as you know, the United States and the Soviet Union were playing out a global game using many different theatres of operation, but perhaps none more critical than the Middle East. Now, the proof of the fact is that by 1973, which is 6 years after the Six-Day War, several things had taken place as a result of the 67 war that were really part of the larger Cold War game. And one of them was the fact that our army, which had been triumphantly victorious in 67, had gone on to have mostly replaced most of its equipment with the latest generation American equipment. We're now, boom, we are no longer going to really dabble with the whole socialist experiment and flirt with Russia. We're going to be in the United States camp, and the United States made sure of that, because if you look, for example, in 67, what were most of the aircraft? And you know what happened in 67? French. In the first few hours of the campaign, the Israeli Air Force took out the entire Egyptian Air Force most of it before it even left the ground, and all of that was done in French Mirages, mostly. But by the time we get to 1973, we're not using French Mirages anymore. We've got the F-4 Phantom, which is the latest generation, and pretty recent too. I mean, those Phantoms had been used in Vietnam. They weren't like old American stuff. They were right up there, the F-4. And our tanks, we're now using them, what became known as the Magach, which is basically an Israeli converted M48 Patton tank. Very, very fast relative to tanks, very good mobility, very good gun speed, and we had done a lot of training on them. So the Cold War had seen Israelis understand that they already had a virtually invincible army that was now re-equipped with the best equipment. That's the first thing. And we were pretty sure that we could handle anything that was going to come. And in some ways, that thinking was not entirely wrong. From around 1970, there had been, and many of you will recall this, what they call Milchemet Tasha, which is the war of attrition. And that was a constant peckering at us with, little mini bombardments. Now, here's the thing, and now we need to really, really draw this map, because I need to show you where the focus of this is all going to be. So here's Israel, and this is already Egypt, and this here, in fact, I'm going to bring it up because it's going to be the focus of the battle. I'm not going to do the north of Israel, I'm just going to do the south of Israel, and here's Egypt. This, of course, is the Mediterranean. Yes? Some people get confused, you'd be surprised. Now, and of course here is the Sinai. All right? So that's really not to scale. Let's call Elat there, but that's the Sinai. Not very to scale, but you get the idea. It's a big triangle. Sits at the complete junction of Africa and Asia. By the way, don't look at your phone. Don't look at anything. Just answer this off the top of your head. How big is the Sinai in Australian terms? Is it as big as Victoria?
No way.
Sorry?
No way.
Bigger than Victoria?
No.
As big as New South Wales? You're going the wrong way? Okay. It is amazingly almost exactly the same size and shape as Tasmania. All right, just to give us an idea. So in fact, it's a little bit smaller than Tasmania, but it's basically the same shape and same size, and it's sitting right there. And slightly drier. And slightly more fought over in the 20th century. Unless you count the Franklin Dam protests and all of that. All right, this of course is all water. This is water. Now, this area here, since the 19th century, has been called the Suez Canal. Because what it enables ships to do is to go from the Mediterranean straight through to the Indian Ocean without having to go around Africa, which saves weeks and weeks and expense and everything. It was a huge engineering project of the 19th century, and it sits there, right there, nationalised by NASA on previous occasions. And now, in brevity, in 1967, Israel took the whole of the Sinai. Now that is immense. It's bigger than the whole land area of Israel itself, of course, and Israel expanded its size 5 times, and it took the Sinai. Now, this is very, very critical to understanding what happened in 73. As you know, we all lived through it, but there were many, many things that have happened since in analysis of this, not to mention the famous Agranat Commission that happened right after this Yom Kippur War. But basically, there was what became known in Israeli society after the Yom Kippur War, became known as the Mechdal. What's the meaning of Mechdal? Sometimes a difficult word to translate, but Mechdal basically means like an oversight, an omission. It indicates a kind of something missing in your thinking. Here's what the Israelis believed. Now, first of all, we have to realize that during the whole war of attrition I just referred to, the Israelis placed on the Suez a line which they called Kav Bar Lev, the Bar Lev line. Why do people always make these pronouncements about the things that they do? It's like with the Titanic, this is unsinkable, right? The Maginot Line, impassable. The Bar Lev Line, impregnable, said Israeli soldiers and Israeli generals. Et ze em lo ovrim. They're not passing that. And it was a very, very, very impressive defense system. It contained about 16 different, this is about 150 kilometers until, or certainly until you get to this lake here, which they call the lake, the Bitter Lake. But there's 150 kilometers, 16 separate fortified bunkers, ditches, minefields, and in front of it all, on the Suez itself, massive sand ramparts called the forts were, and these ramparts together were ma'ozim, but they were literally somewhere between 60 to 80 feet high. They were inclined at an angle of 60 degrees. At the bottom, there were these concrete barriers. There were pipelines underneath it that fed straight into the sewers, containing massive amounts of flammable oil that could be suddenly turned, any section of the Suez Canal, into an inferno. They were impregnable. The Israelis believed, number one, that there's no way the Egyptians would ever be able to cross the Bar Lev line. Number two, even if the Egyptians threw everything they had at the Bar Lev line, we know that we would have at least 24 to 48 hours notice on them having any chance of breaking through the line, and therefore, at the end of the day, whatever was going to go down, our Air Force will deal with it. Israel's air force was just regarded as fundamentally invincible. And so we would have 24 to 48 hours notice on this, because there's no way the Egyptians are going to break the Maginot Line without serious forces and equipment. And by the time they schlep all that there, our air force would have come and smashed them out of existence. But even beyond that, the Israelis did not believe that the Egyptians would attack. They did not believe that Egypt would ever have the cojones to attack Israel unless they had reached something like parity in their air force. The entire Egyptian air force, of course, was decimated. The Russians had been resupplying them, but they did not believe that Egypt had parity with them, even on numbers, let alone on training and skill. And also, even with all that, the Israelis said, if the Egyptians still want to attack, we'll get plenty of notice on it, because you can't just bring a force to take the Sinai and break through that without us knowing about it. So that entire set of thinking was called the Mechdal in the light of what happened in the Yom Kippur War. And part of the problem also, and I'm sorry to say, but I still hear people say this, and maybe there are people of our generation that grew up with this attitude, because I know when I grew up this was the attitude, because I attended Zionist youth camps and I attended Jewish day schools, and I know the attitude that we were taught, and that is, we're just superior, the Arabs are useless, and they don't know how to fight. And that all they have to do is see one Israeli tank or one Israeli rifle, and they all run. They're frightened, they're not well trained, they're just, So this attitude is, at the end of the day, they're useless. Now, I've got to tell you that Nasser, who of course was in charge of Egypt, died in 1970, and he was replaced by Anwar Sadat. And Sadat was a serious person. And Sadat realized that there was going to be no chance to reform his country unless he brought them out of this humiliating moral morass that the Egyptian society and economy had found itself in as a result of being completely schmeissed in the 67 war. And so he started planning the Yom Kippur War well in advance, in an operation that was planned for 2 to 3 years before it happened, in the most incredible secrecy, called Operation Badr. Now, Operation Badr, which is the operation to cross the Suez and retake the Sinai, was named after, to call it that just shows Sadat's kind of, political vision. Because that was the name, that was one of Muhammad's first ever battles that he fought against the Qurayshi tribe. It's like massive folkloric battle in the history of early Islam. It was called the Battle of Badr. So he said, this is Operation Badr. He saw himself as an incarnation of that spirit. That's how fundamental it was to the Egyptians. But they had to do the entire thing with deception. And even Israeli intelligence and analysts and generals after the war had to say, whatever happened in that war, you've got to hand it to Sadat, because how they were able to do what they did in the 2 years leading up without anyone knowing, even the Soviets, who had 20,000 advisors in Egypt, military personnel in Egypt, as advisors on equipment, didn't know. They had their suspicions, but they didn't know. But not only was it an operation planned by Sadat, it was an operation planned in concert with Hafez al-Assad in Syria. This operation was so secret that even division commanders were not told about it till 48 hours before it happened. First of all, they trained all of their battalions separately in exercises that were not explained, little bits at a time in bits of parts of it. But in the weeks leading up to Yom Kippur of 1973, They brought hundreds of thousands of soldiers over here at the same time that they made some very public non-mobilizing, in other words, demobilizing of certain divisions, so that that's how it would look. They put misinformation in the newspapers to talk about how disorganized Egyptian army was and how spare parts kept going missing. They put out a total pretense of looking completely disorganized and nowhere near going to war. They even faked Sadat being ill a week before and that he was going to go to Europe to have some treatment. Every single aspect. So convincing was their entire operation of deception that Israel's chief military intelligence analysts simply did not pick it up. When the Russians were told about it on October the 3rd, and bearing in mind that October the 6th is when the war is going to start, the Russians picked themselves up and left Egypt. That was what rang an alarm bell with some analysts. Then reports started coming in from some of their more deep-burrowed intelligence feeds that something was about to happen. But even then, the Israeli political and military leadership said, it's not going to happen. They would need to attack us on two fronts. But Syria is mobilizing near the border. Yeah, but Syria is not going to attack us in the Golan without Egypt. And we know that Egypt is not going to attack. So how could they attack if they're not going to attack, if we know they're not going to attack? The first indication that Golda Meir, who was the Prime Minister, had that there was going to be a war that day was at 4:30 in the morning. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, she had an hour-long meeting with her defense minister, who was Moshe Dayan, and the Ramat Kal, the chief of general staff of the IDF, who was not Rabin, David Elazar.
Golda warned by the King Hussein himself.
King Hussein had flown a couple of days before to Tel Aviv. King Hussein flew to Tel Aviv in the week before and said to Golda, there's going to be a war. And Golda says, thanks for your advice. We don't think so, and we have it in hand. Therefore, mobilization came extremely late.
If the war was so secret that the Egyptians and the Russians didn't hear about till October the 3rd, how did King Hussein know a week before even the Russians?
He had probably been...
Because he's King Hussein. And he would know about it. He would know about it because he would have been part of a very, very, very high level. I mean, even he wouldn't have only heard about it till the week before, but remember, it's got to be coordinated between Syria and Egypt. And I can't even begin to imagine what King Hussein of Jordan's intelligence networks are anywhere, but he knew about it. It's a good question. It's a good question, and it's a fascinating question, but yeah.
So why did he tell the Israelis that?
Why did he tell the Israelis? Because the Jordanians and the Israelis... She said, why did he tell the Israelis? Because this idea that it's all the Arabs against us is a myth.
All right.
That's as far as I can go into that at the moment. King Hussein was already on an agenda of ultimately, eventually wanting there to be some kind of peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. 1973 was not the time to do it. It didn't happen for another 20 years. But Hussein was not innately an enemy of the Jewish people. And it was in his interest to have a stable Israel on his western border and not some amalgamation of Syria and Egypt. So the mobilization was late. And here's the key. By the time you get to the afternoon of Yom Kippur, on the 6th of October 1973, here is what we're looking at. On this side, on the western side of the canal, Egypt has about 1,250 tanks. It has 100,000 soldiers, infantry. and it has 2,000 pieces of heavy artillery bombardment equipment. On the eastern side of the canal, Israel, at the time of the opening of this battle, Israel has, in the entire Sinai, 260 tanks, basically 3 different brigades, but only about a third of those would have been anywhere near the Bar-Lev line. The other 2 brigades would have been here and here. They had 400 soldiers, that's against 100,000, 400 soldiers to hold the Bar-Lev line, which is classic reflection of the Mechdal in all of its aspects. And they had about 40 pieces of artillery. But still, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, that's okay. That's okay. It'll still take 24 to 48 hours for the Egyptians to get across the Bar-Lev line, by which time we'll know they're coming, by which time the IAF will come screaming down and it'll be over. We'll just sit and watch the show. For weeks, the Egyptians had been moving men and equipment. And when I say and equipment, I mean seriously interesting and different equipment up to the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is about 180 to 200 meters wide and about 20 to 25 meters deep. But it's only about maybe, what are we talking? You know, what would that be? 200 meters, say from here to Orong Road. Yep. The first thing that the Israelis find, and I've got to tell you that even at that 8 o'clock in the morning meeting that Golda and Dado and Dayan had, and the very, very top echelon, after this highly convincing intelligence reports, the head of Israeli military intelligence flew to Europe to speak with their top intelligence operative that was placed in Egypt and said, it's happening today. Even then, they had wrong information. They were given 6 o'clock, not what actually happened. So they weren't even expecting anything would happen. They didn't know what would happen. But at exactly 2 o'clock, at the same time that over 1,000 Assyrian tanks started to roll over the Golan, Egypt launched itself at the Bar-Lev line. First of all, earlier that morning, Egyptian frogmen had swum through the water and sealed up all of the pipe outlets coming from the Bar-Lev line, so they couldn't touch the water itself. Then, at 2 o'clock, or at 5 to 2, the Egyptians opened up on the Bar-Lev line, and this is not an exaggeration, one of the longest artillery preparatory fire exercises in military history. It lasted for nearly an hour, 53 minutes. In the first minute alone, 10,000 shells in the first minute alone, with no warning. That hour of total repression fire was followed up by thousands of Egyptian paratroopers who crossed the line in rubber dinghies and brought with them equipment. And the fundamental equipment that they brought with them, and it was actually the idea that had been some time before in the planning of Operation Badr. It was a junior Egyptian lieutenant that had come up with this idea that was eventually implemented, because they tried the massive sand bunkers, they tried dynamiting them, they tried bulldozing them. But what eventually did they hit upon that they used in the Yom Kippur War? Water cannons. And they simply blasted the sand, and within 2 hours they were able to create, whereas the Israelis had imagined it was going to take somewhere, Egyptian engineers, it would take them 24 to 48 hours to break that thing. In 2 hours they broke through it with water cannon, and suddenly, of course, the Egyptian engineers are putting bridges on the Suez, and tanks are rolling across, and Tens of thousands of men are rolling across, completely swamping. Engineers are coming and they're laying down tracks over the minefields. The Israeli fortifications are surrounded and run over, and the Egyptians just move forward to a position about 5 or 6 kilometers into the east side of the Suez. That is the opening volley shot. That sent, now obviously, Israel didn't sit back and watch that happen. Within a very short space of time, as soon as they're starting to do that, the Israeli Air Force sends a serious number of planes, dozens of planes, zooming low across the desert, just ready to completely take out this attacking force. But it's a different world, and it's a different army. The Israeli jets are met with SAM missiles supplied by Russia. The Egyptians created a wall of fire. They had brought their SAM missile launchers right up to the banks of the Suez, and no Israeli aircraft could really get within 15 miles. You have to realize, between here and the Golan, Israel lost a third of its air force in the first few hours. Plus helicopters, we couldn't get close. The Egyptians, and this is one of the massive things that had happened in the planning for Operation Badr, is that they had neutralized Israel's great tactical weapon, which was its air superiority, and take it out of the equation, just as we had done to the Egyptians in 67. This wall of fire. Israel eventually had to suspend air operations in the south, not only because they were losing an unconscionably high number of aircraft per flight, but because what air force they did retain was desperately needed in the north. These were big decisions that had to be made. Decisions such as, if Egypt pushes through, then they've still got hundreds of kilometers to get to before they even get to the Negev. But if they cross the Golan, then they're already at Tveria and Tzfat and the Galil. So basically, the Israeli leadership had to leave the whole defense of the Sinai to the tank corps alone. You're on your own, defend the state of Israel. Now, the first thing that Israelis were going to do, obviously, because it's written in concrete in Israeli military thinking, is what do you do if you're under attack? Counterattack. Stuff defense, counterattack. Well, not stuff defense, but counterattack is defense. So obviously the 2 brigades that are in the Sinai, and of course they're bolstered up now because we've now got a few more tanks coming, because who returns from retirement? Having taken retirement just recently, Ariel Sharon comes with his armoured division and says, I know these Egyptians, I know how to take the Sinai. And he did know how to take the Sinai, because in 1967, Ariel Sharon, famously at the Battle of Abu Agela, had effectively taken the Sinai with his armoured division in in a tank battle that was so brilliant that it was used by military schools around the world. This is how you win a tank battle. Ariel Sharon was a brilliant soldier, and he'd fought in 48, he'd fought in 56, he led a platoon in 56, the Suez, so he knew that. He won the Battle of Abu Agela in 67, and now he's coming to save once again the Sinai from these rude Egyptians. Bearing in mind that Sadat's original idea, and had he stuck to it, it might have been interesting, was that he wanted to cross the Bar-Lev line just a few kilometers and stop. That was going to be his whole point. They was going to use that as a way of forcing Israel into some kind of arrangement over the Sinai where he would end up getting it back, but it would be a limited but definitive victory that he could take back to the Egyptian public. The counterattack came. The Israelis launched their counterattack on October 8th. That famous press conference that you can see reels of, with David Elazar standing there going, "We have the situation under control. We are counterattacking now. It will only be a few hours before we turn them, we smash their bones." Well, someone did not inform David Elazar about what was going to go down, because that first counterattack of several hundred Israeli tanks against this failed, and failed at tremendous cost. We lost hundreds of soldiers and we lost dozens and dozens of tanks. Anyone know why? What we didn't see? Handheld anti-tank missiles supplied recently by the Russians. This is 1973, ladies and gentlemen. So the Russians themselves have been investing a lot of money in equipment, and they're selling this equipment to their proxies around the world, and particularly the anti-tank Saga missile, which was handheld and could be operated, had a wire outlet, which meant that it could be hand operated in flight by the operator using a joystick to be directed straight onto the tank. It was a 5 kilogram warhead, and it could penetrate the Magach shielding, which was pretty strong, but it could penetrate into it and blow the tank up. And it did. And so we were facing waves of these, waves of RPGs. The Egyptian Air Force was also harassing us, but they were mostly out of the picture because the SAM wall was able to, of the Egyptians was able to take care of the Air Force. And in any event, the Air Force had to focus on the Golan. They tried in Operation Tagar to take out on the 8th and the 9th to take out the SAM wall, but they couldn't do it, and eventually the decision was made to fight on the Golan. So basically by the 9th and the 10th, with the first Israeli counteroffensive having been disastrous, a bit like Latrun, but the Israelis were faced with no other choice but to bunker down here in a defensive line facing the Egyptian front several kilometers away. All right? That's the situation by the time we get to around the 9th or 10th of October. Now, what's interesting about that time, of course, is that is when we just start to see the turnaround in the Golan. The situation in the Golan, the famous Battle of the Valley of Tears, which maybe we'll do another time. Some of you, the Emek HaBacha, the 7 tanks against 700, the whole famous, unbelievable stories that happened in the Golan. And there were several people that came out of the battles of the Golan. We lost so many soldiers in the Golan fighting for the Golan, but some soldiers came out, and there are probably more merit of valor's medals awarded for that than just about any other war in Israel's history. But that tide was just starting to turn. But by this time, the situation around the 9th, after the failure of this counteroffensive, and the Golan still very uncertain, things were looking very, very precarious. This is when Moshe Dayan lost his panties and was running around going, "Oh, it's the end of the third temple," was actually his phrase, right? Meaning the temple's about to fall, the state of Israel's going to go under, we can't contain this, and Golda's going, right? Then he says, then in these big meetings, you read the records, the meetings and the interviews, there are 2 conflicting stories, and I think they're both correct. Because there's a famous meeting that's recorded and where Dayan says to Golda, we need to call the guy from the Atomic Commission to come in here, and we need to think about going nuclear. And Golda says to him in very, very uncertain, in very, very unambiguous terms, that's not the way this is going to be fought. Tishkach mizeh, she says to him in those words, forget that. Forget it. But we also know, pretty much, that on that same night, later on that same night, she actually ordered the loading of 13 20-kiloton nuclear missiles onto Jericho warheads onto Jericho missiles and submarines in a procedure that would have been highly noticed by the Americans. The Americans realized that the Israelis were preparing to go nuclear, at least they were given that impression. That then caused Nixon to tell Kissinger that Operation Nickelgrass, which is, we are going to send the Israelis as much equipment as they want and as they need. And from that moment, just hundreds of American Air Force planes were bringing equipment to replenish the Israeli army, which had been decimated in the first few days of this war. Mind you, you couldn't fly directly to Israel because the European countries were saying, if you're sending equipment to restock Israel, you're not landing here. Only one European country allowed the American flights to land. Who knows what country that was? Portugal, exactly. And even after landing in Portugal to refuel, they had to fly down the middle of the very center of the Mediterranean so they would not be in anyone else's territory when they flew in, straight into Ben Gurion, and the equipment was sent directly to the two fronts. Now, by the time you get to the 12th, 13th and 14th, Israel has completely turned the tables in the Golan. The famous meeting that Golda has with her ministers, where they say, what do we do now? And what does Golda say? Attack! I mean, there was a thought that we've recaptured the Golan, let's just bunker in now, the Syrians not going to come back and try and retake it. But no, Golda felt it was very, very important, just in case we lost the Sinai, because this was still a disaster, that there had to be some positive outcome from this war. And we had to teach the Syrians a bit of a lesson here, never to do that again. And we advanced into Syria within 40 kilometers of Damascus. We were shelling the outside of Damascus. The Israeli Air Force actually bombed the military headquarters of Syria in Damascus. So that was turning. Mind you, you also had other religious figures around the world, such as the Lubavitcher Rebbe in New York, writing letters to Ariel Sharon going, take Damascus, take Cairo, take Damascus. Even if you just hold it for a few days, you've got to take it. Right? It's amazing, the different people. Anyway, yes?
And he said if you go all the way to Damascus, you can dictate the terms of the peace.
Correct. We don't know that he would have been wrong about that. There are some who think that had we taken Damascus and had we actually removed Assad, that would have been a completely different picture. But taking Damascus was not going to be a picnic. We didn't end up taking any major cities in this war, but it was an interesting thought. Back to the Sinai. Assad in Syria, with the Israeli army on his physical doorstep, is freaking out and tells Sadat, you have to do something. And Sadat goes, you're right, I have to help you. We are going to distract the Israeli army again so that you can try and push them out. In fact, in the meantime, King Hussein of Jordan sends a bit of his army up to help the Syrians. The Iraq sends an army to help the Syrians. I know what you're thinking, but Hussein actually rings the Israelis and says, I'm not really interested in fighting, and we're going to try and avoid fighting you guys, but unless I send a force into Syria to help the Syrians, how's that going to be for me, at the next time I'm at the Ramadan supper and I'm sitting with my guys and, So Sadat decides that what is necessary, even though he's held this position now and the Israelis are holding their position, that before the Israelis can fully resupply and before things get too stable, he wants a greater slice of the pie. And he's going to advance into the Sinai in a massive advance of these 1,000 tanks. Everybody follow? That's going to attract the Israeli army's attention, relieve the situation for Assad in Syria. We're not sure entirely why Sadat wanted to do this. Shazli and his other generals were saying, are you nuts? We've got this entrenched position. We've achieved the operational outcomes of Operation Badr. What are you doing? Sadat goes, no, we're going to do this. He overrules all his generals, and en masse, on the 14th of October, 1,000 tanks start moving eastward to grab the Mitla Pass and other major passes through the Sinai. And that, my friend, is when he made the several fundamental errors. Yeah. The biggest error, probably, which his generals warned him about, was that all of these 1,000 tanks then moved out from the protection of the Sam wall of fire. So they were going to be easy pickings for the Israeli Air Force, which now was not as acutely pressured in the north. Brand new sets of Phantom 4s recently are supplied, and with the time and ability to come back and deal with the situation. Plus, by this time, the Israelis had managed to entrench themselves in very, very, very solid and good positions in the Sinai. Positions such as, and it's important to understand how a tank can position itself, because it can be just near the ridge of a hill, and you can't see the tank, but its turret can see you. So it can literally fire on you, but you can't see it. And the reach of the Makach was like a couple of kilometers. So, with all of those considerations, plus Israeli numbers were now a bit bolstered, and as this 1,000 tanks come, they're facing about 700, 750 Israeli tanks, but they get seriously geschmeist. In the first few hours of that, without the protection of their wall of fire, and due to the Israeli superior positioning plus Israeli superior training in gunnery, they lost 260 tanks in the first 2 to 3 hours of that battle. It was a disaster for the Egyptians, and eventually they called a retreat. Now, importantly, and I know I've only got 5 minutes to do this, but I'm now actually at the key point of the battle. The Egyptians made one other fundamental condition possible that hadn't been possible before. When they advanced east, there were basically two Egyptian armies, not just divisions, but armies on the east of the Suez. There was the second army sitting here, and the third army sitting here. And when they advanced eastward, what the Israelis noticed was that there was a gap of just a few kilometers between these two armies. And of course, Ariel Sharon goes, I'm going through that gap. And with the, well, not just engineers, I'll get in a second. And his commanding officers are going, no, you're not. You're not going to go through that gap just yet, because before you go through that gap, you're going to have to deal with eliminating and defending your flank, which would be this flank here of the second army, is going to be something you're going to have to deal with to create that bridgehead. Otherwise, you might be a hero and cross the Suez, but you'll be there on your own. And we're not prepared to lose an entire Israeli division on the other side of the Suez simply because you have to prove that you got bigger baits in than anyone else. So frankly, Arik, you're not doing that until he goes, I don't care, I'm going, I'm doing it. And he goes over their heads. He goes over the heads of David El-Azhar, and he calls up Moshe Dayan. And Moshe Dayan, defense minister, gives him permission to do it. I mean, Ariel Sharon was not good at taking orders. As it happened, that fight with the flank of the Second Army at a place called Chinese Farm was one of the toughest fights of the Yom Kippur War. And Ariel didn't really help out there that much. He sent a few tanks, token, but he was much more interested. He believed that it was more important to get across the Suez and start harassing the Second and Third Army from behind their own lines, which would cause them to collapse, rather than necessarily create a solid, properly defended bridgehead or canal crossing. Nevertheless, the first thing Arik did was they send in 750 paratrooper commandos under Dani Mat, and they come through, and together with about 20 tanks, floated across in rubber dinghies, because it took days. The Israelis had a special bridge built already before the war, but it took quite some time to get there, to get to the Suez. They had to schlep it down, 12 tanks to build this long bridge. Meanwhile, so they only had 20 tanks and 750 commandos on the west of the Suez, but they were basically given one job, and that was to take out all the SAM air cover, as well as destroy any infrastructure they could find. And eventually, the Israelis, by around the 19th, the Israelis were able to cross and create a bridgehead properly across the Suez, and then just poured in several divisions. One division, all led by generals, one division under Adam went south, Magen's division went west, and Sharon's division went north, in very broad terms. Effectively, by the 22nd and 23rd, when the UN was trying to impose a ceasefire, which Israel was pretending not to hear, they managed to encompass the entire Third Army. Sharon wanted to take the city of Ismailia here. He couldn't quite do that, but he managed to cut off supply networks for the second, but the Third Army was completely surrounded. Kissinger told the Israeli government that elimination of the Egyptian Third Army is not an option. There were acts of cruelty on both sides. There were acts of humane behaviour on both sides. It was a very, very dicey situation, but eventually the ceasefire came in on the 24th of October. But it was a war, and I know it's 9 o'clock, it was a war that fundamentally was to change Israeli military thinking. No longer was it going to be acceptable to analyse what your opponent's intentions were, because you might get that right and you might get that wrong. It was going to be based on what your opponent could do, and if they did it, what you would have to do to meet that. It's facts on the ground. What kind of defence, what kind of army, what kind of situation do I have to have if the unthinkable was to happen? Not to question whether or not it would happen. This fundamental changes, obviously, much of the political leadership lost their positions over the following couple of years. Golda herself ended up having to resign, was replaced by Yitzhak Rabin. Dayan went. They all went, and of course, all of the top brass of the military, many of them were gone. Ariel Sharon comes out again a hero. But all of this is, I've had to do some headlines, but it's really the idea that the incredible vision to penetrate the Egyptian army, what should be potentially its strongest point, which was actually its weakest point, and that opportunity was only given because Sadat tried to bite off more than he could chew, and ultimately brought Israel west of the Suez. That itself, another fundamental part of Israeli military thinking. It's not just about counterattack, it's counter-offensive. You've come into our backyard, we're going to go into yours, and we're going to show you what it is. However, I hope that the lesson that Israel and that the Jewish people generally, I remember when it was happening, you know, and there was a great big solidarity. Do you remember that one on the Maccabi Oval?
Absolutely.
And I remember Joe Berenson spoke, and I remember, and Uri Tamal.
We go all the way to Damascus.
Yes, they were all a bit gung-ho, yeah. But they would have, that changed really the whole nature, and of course within 4 to 5 years we had a peace agreement with Egypt. It hasn't always been the warmest peace relation we've had, but there's never been another war, and there's probably more cooperation in that structure than we sometimes realise. So we've come to the end now. I'll just take one more minute. We've come to the end of this very, very broad series, and you have been an amazing audience because you've allowed me to at least express some of these ideas. And we have by no means, of course, looked at all the battles, and we haven't looked at all the ways in which history has been changed by battles, but hopefully we've gained some insight. Jews don't like to fight. We don't like to fight, but it would be very, very wrong to say that we are a completely passive people. If our home is threatened, we will defend it. And in order for that sentence to make sense, we have to have a home. And the more you look, particularly on the subject tonight, you look at the sacrifices made in our generation to ensure that there is a home in Israel, then you realise that it's a project that is worth all of the Jewish people defending all of the time. And a lot of us here can't jump on a tank anymore or run up a hill with the thing. But also, we can contribute in a great many ways. So thank you for following me that, because how amazing is it that we are part of a people that is fighting battles in the same places that our ancestors fought battles over 3,000 years ago, in the very same geography and in the same, and sometimes it seems even against the same enemies. This is not the first time we encountered Egypt. And so we have a great, I think that the history of Jewish warfare is underestimated. I think it's too little understood. And I think it's a huge contributing chapter of our journey in the world and what we're about. So thank you very much for listening to all of that.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the talk. For episode notes and transcripts, or to learn more about David's next classes and projects, visit davidsolomon.online. You can also find David on Instagram or Facebook. Thank you. We hope to see you again soon.